There are things in life that you never imagine you'll go through, and discovering that your own brother, the person you shared your entire childhood with, is plotting your destruction is one of them. My name is Daniel Carter. I'm 38 years old. I'm a manager at a car dealership in Phoenix, Arizona, and for 15 years I blindly trusted my younger brother Marcus. I gave him a job, lent him money when he was broke, helped pay his bills when he lost his apartment. But all of that meant nothing. Before continuing, subscribe to the channel and leave a comment telling me where you're watching from. Because this story will show how the people who sleep under your roof can be sharpening a knife to stab you in the back. It all started 3 months ago, on a typical Tuesday in September. I was in the dealership's office reviewing the month's sales figures when my finance manager Tom walked into the room with a strange look on his face. He closed the door behind him, which was unusual, and placed a folder on my desk without saying a word. When I opened that folder, my stomach churned. It contained bank transfers, dozens of them, going from the company account directly to an account I didn't recognize. The amounts ranged from $2,000 to $8,000, and when I added it all up, it came to almost $180,000, embezzled over an 8-month period. Tom looked at me and said he had taken a while to tell me because he was trying to trace where the money was going, and when he finally did, he couldn't believe what he had discovered. The destination account belonged to an LLC registered in Nevada, but when Tom dug deeper, using a private investigator, he discovered that the real owner of that shell company was Marcus, my brother, the guy I put in as sales manager 3 years ago, who had access to the financial systems because I trusted him completely. I felt my hands trembling as I held those papers. Tom told me there was more, that Marcus wasn't working alone, and that we needed to act fast before he realized we'd found out. My first reaction was denial. It couldn't be true. Marcus was my brother. We grew up sharing a tiny room in a trailer park in Tucson. We both swore that when we grew up, we'd help each other get out of that life. But the more I looked at those documents, the more it all made sense. Marcus's sudden trips to Las Vegas that he said were to visit suppliers, the new car he bought 6 months ago, a BMW 5 Series that cost about $65,000, even though he only earned $4,500 a month. Tom handed me more documents. There were emails between Marcus and another person, someone outside the company, discussing how they could increase the embezzled amounts without raising suspicion. They had a detailed plan. They created fake invoices from non-existent suppliers, approved payments for services that were never rendered, and split the money 50-50. When I asked Tom who Marcus's accomplice was, he slid another sheet of paper toward me. It was a screenshot of a WhatsApp conversation. The contact was saved as J, but I recognized the phone number immediately. It was Jessica, my sister-in-law. The two of them were in this together, planning to steal from me while they had dinner at my house every Sunday, while I paid their birthday bills, while I treated their 3-year-old son like he was my own nephew. The anger that surged within me at that moment was unlike anything I had ever felt. It wasn't the explosive rage that makes you scream and break things. It was a cold, calculated anger, the kind of anger that makes you think with absolute clarity. I told Tom not to do anything yet, not to confront Marcus, not to alert anyone. We needed more evidence. We needed to build a solid case, not only to recover the money, but to ensure that Marcus and Jessica paid for every penny stolen. Tom agreed and told me he had already contacted a lawyer specializing in financial crimes, a guy named Richard Bowman, who had an office in Scottsdale and an impeccable reputation for taking down fraudsters in court. That night I went home in a state of silent shock. My wife, Linda, sensed something was wrong as soon as I walked through the door. We've been married for 12 years, and she knows me better than anyone. When she asked what happened, I couldn't hold back. I told her everything, showed her the documents Tom had given me, and watched the expression on her face change from concern to utter horror. Linda had always been skeptical of Marcus. She said he had a manipulative side that I refused to see because we were siblings. Now, sitting in our living room in Tempe with those papers scattered on the coffee table, I had to admit she'd been right all along. Linda got straight to the point. She said we needed to protect our assets immediately, that if Marcus was capable of stealing from the company, he would be capable of anything if he felt cornered. She reminded me that Marcus had keys to our house, that he knew where we kept important documents, that he knew the passwords to many things because I never hid anything from him. That same night, we changed all the locks on the house. I called our bank and set up alerts on all accounts. I transferred our emergency money, about $45,000, to a new account that Marcus didn't know about. Linda suggested installing security cameras around the property, and I immediately agreed. The next day, I met with Richard Bowman in his office. The guy was about 55 years old, with perfectly trimmed grey hair, a suit that probably cost more than my car, and a handshake that conveyed absolute confidence. When I showed him everything Tom had compiled, Richard was silent for about 5 minutes, just flipping through the documents and making notes. Finally, he looked up and told me that this was one of the most blatant cases of internal fraud he had seen in years. It wasn't just theft, it was systematic, premeditated theft, carried out by someone who knew exactly what they were doing and who was sure they would never get caught. Richard explained that we could go two ways: resolve this civilly through a lawsuit in civil court, or involve the criminal authorities. I didn't have to think twice. I wanted both things. He wanted Marcus to return every penny, with interest and damages, and he wanted him to go to jail. Richard nodded and said we would need more time to build a solid case. He recommended that I continue acting normally with Marcus, not letting on that I knew anything, because if he ran away or hid the money, it would be much harder to recover anything. This meant I would have to look my brother in the face every day, pretend everything was fine, while inside I was seething with hatred. Richard also suggested that we hire a digital forensic investigator to scour all the company's computers and systems, because there was probably much more hidden than what we had already discovered. The next few days were the hardest of my life. Marcus arrived at the dealership every day with that fake smile, greeted everyone, cracked jokes, and sold cars as if nothing was happening. During lunch, he would sit in my office and talk about soccer, his son, and plans for the upcoming Thanksgiving. He even had the audacity to ask me for a raise, saying he was working very hard and deserved to be recognized. I had to bite my tongue until it bled to avoid exploding right there. I agreed to consider his request, and when he left the room, I stared at the closed door, wondering how blind I had been for so long. Linda kept me sane during that time. Every night, she reminded me that revenge had to be calculated, that acting impulsively would only give Marcus a chance to escape. She was right, but that didn't make things any easier. The worst part was when Marcus and Jessica invited us to dinner at their new house the following Saturday. It was a beautiful house, contemporary Spanish style, with a heated pool and an incredible view of the desert. While Marcus gave us the tour of the property, showing us the marble finishes, the imported luxury appliances, the home theater in the basement, all I could think about was that every brick in that house had been paid for with money stolen from me. Money that should have been funding the expansion of the dealership, paying bonuses to honest employees, securing my own family's future. During dinner, Jessica served an expensive wine, about $300 a bottle, and talked about the vacation they were planning to Cancun the following month. Marcus laughed and said they were finally getting the life they'd always dreamed of, that the hard work was paying off. I raised my glass and joked along, but inside I was imagining his face when the federal agents showed up at the door. Linda squeezed my hand under the table, a silent reminder to stay calm. When we left that night, Jessica hugged me and whispered that I was the best brother-in-law in the world, that they were so grateful for everything I had done for the family. I got in the car and had to hold back tears, not of sadness, but of such deep anger that it scared me. Richard called the following Monday with news. The forensic investigator had finished analyzing the systems and discovered that the fraud was even bigger than we had imagined. The meeting with the FBI agents took place in a discreet room in Richard Bowman's office. There were two agents, a woman named Agent Sarah Morrison and a man named Agent Kevin Torres, both from the Financial Crimes Division. They had that serious, professional demeanor you see in movies, but at the same time, they were surprisingly human. Agent Morrison began by explaining that cases like mine were more common than I imagined, that family frauds accounted for almost 30% of all white-collar crimes in the United States. But what made my case special was the scale and sophistication. Marcus wasn't an amateur who embezzled money on impulse. He had built an elaborate operation that showed planning and premeditation over years. Agent Torres asked me to tell the whole story from the beginning, and I spent the next 2 hours recalling every detail. I talked about how Marcus came to live with me 5 years ago when he was unemployed and about to be evicted, how I paid off his debts, more than $15,000 in credit cards and predatory loans, how I hired him at the dealership even without experience in the automotive field because I believed that family takes care of family. Agent Morrison took detailed notes while Agent Torres recorded everything on a small digital device. When I finished, the two exchanged a look that I couldn't fully decipher, but it seemed like a mixture of pity and determination. Agent Morrison explained the next step. They needed time to build the criminal case, which meant investigating all the shell companies, tracing every bank transfer, and possibly obtaining search warrants for Marcus and Jessica's home. This would take 4 to 6 weeks. During this period, it was crucial that I continue acting normally, that I don't confront Marcus or give any indication that something was wrong. If he suspected he was being investigated, he might destroy evidence or flee. And cases like this had already fallen apart because of a hasty approach. She assured me that they understood how difficult this would be, but it was absolutely necessary to ensure that Marcus didn't get away with it through legal technicalities. I left that meeting feeling strangely relieved and terrified at the same time. Relieved because I finally had powerful people on my side, people who knew exactly how to handle situations like this. Terrified because now this was real in a way that there was no going back. It wasn't just anger and a desire for revenge anymore. It was a federal legal process that would likely result in my brother going to prison for years. I drove to an empty parking lot near Papago Park and sat in the car for an hour, just processing everything. I picked up my phone and looked at old photos, pictures of Marcus and me as children, teenagers, young adults trying to survive in the world. Where had it all gone wrong? At what point did he decide that betraying me was worth it? Linda was waiting when I got home. She had prepared my favorite dish, homemade lasagna, and there was a bottle of Maker's Mark whiskey on the table, my preferred brand. She knew I would need it. While we ate dinner, I told her about the meeting with the FBI, about the timeline, about the fact that in a few weeks Marcus would be in federal custody. Linda held my hand and said something that has stuck in my mind ever since. She said that family betrayal is the worst betrayal of all, because it destroys not only the present, but also taints all memories of the past. Every good memory I had with Marcus was now stained by the question, was he already planning to betray me back then? It was impossible not to rethink every interaction, every conversation, every shared moment through this new, dark lens. The following days dragged on like molasses. At the dealership, I had to attend the weekly sales meetings where Marcus presented numbers that I now knew were partially fabricated. He had an impressive ability to lie while looking people straight in the eye. During one of these meetings, he even suggested we hire more sales staff because the business was growing so much. I outwardly agreed, while inwardly wondering how he had the nerve to sit there and propose spending more of the company's money that he was actively plundering. Tom, my finance manager, was also at the meeting, and when our eyes met for a second, I saw the same simmering anger reflected back. After the meeting, Tom pulled me aside and said he'd discovered something new. Marcus had used his access to the systems to alter inventory reports, making it appear as if we'd sold fewer cars than we actually had. The difference between the real numbers and the reported numbers was where he hid some of the embezzled money. It was about 12 cars over the last 18 months, with an average value of $35,000 each. That meant another $420,000 in discrepancies that we hadn't yet fully accounted for. Tom was pale when he told me this, his hands trembling slightly. He said he'd dedicated 20 years of his life to that dealership, helped build it from when we were just a small operation selling used cars, and seeing someone destroy it all out of pure greed made him sick. I immediately called Richard Bowman and relayed the new information. Richard sighed on the other end of the line and said this elevated the case to a completely different level. That night I couldn't sleep. I lay staring at the ceiling, listening to Linda's soft breathing beside me, and thinking about how my life had turned into a nightmare in a matter of weeks. There was a part of me that still wanted to believe there was some explanation, some giant misunderstanding that would make everything make sense. But I knew the truth. The documents didn't lie. The bank transfers didn't lie. The emails between Marcus and Jessica discussing how much money they had managed to steal that month didn't lie. My brother had looked at me every day for years, had called me his best friend, had said he was grateful for everything I had done for him, and all the while he was plotting my financial ruin. The turning point came on a Thursday, 2 weeks after my meeting with the FBI. Marcus arrived at my office around 3 in the afternoon with a proposal. He said he had thought a lot about the future and thought we should consider selling the dealership. There was a California investment group interested in buying automotive operations in Arizona, and they had offered $4.2 million for our business. Marcus explained that if we sold, after paying all debts and taxes, each of us would walk away with approximately $1.8 million net. He painted a beautiful picture of how we could retire early, live off investments, and finally relax after years of hard work. And as he spoke, it all became crystal clear to me. That was his final plan. Marcus wasn't just stealing money little by little. He was laying the groundwork for one big final heist. If we sold the dealership, he'd pocket almost $2 million clean, plus all the money he'd already embezzled, and disappear before anyone discovered the full extent of the fraud. It was brilliant, in a perverse way. By the time the new owners eventually discovered the financial irregularities, Marcus would be long gone, probably in some country without an extradition treaty, living like a king with my money. I looked at him sitting there in front of me, grinning that fake smile, and I had to use all my willpower not to jump over the table and strangle him with my bare hands. Instead, I smiled back and said it was an interesting idea, that I needed to think about it and discuss it with Linda. Marcus seemed pleased with my response. He stood up, patted my shoulder in an almost paternal way, and said it was time for us to think about ourselves for a change, that we had worked hard enough and deserved to enjoy life. When he left the office, I grabbed my phone and sent an urgent message to Richard and the FBI agents. We couldn't wait 6 more weeks. Marcus was speeding up his plans, and if we didn't act fast, he would get away with everything. Agent Morrison responded within 15 minutes. She said they could expedite the process, but we would need to act in a coordinated manner. They already had enough evidence to obtain search and arrest warrants, but they wanted to catch Marcus and Jessica off guard to maximize their chances of recovering the money. Morrison suggested I arrange a family gathering over the weekend, something casual like a barbecue, and tell Marcus that I was seriously considering the offer to sell the dealership. This would make him feel confident and careless. Meanwhile, the agents would be preparing everything to make the approach the following Monday when Marcus arrived at work. I followed the instructions exactly as Agent Morrison had specified. I called Marcus on Friday and invited him to a barbecue on Sunday. I said that Linda and I had discussed the sale proposal and wanted to talk more about it in a relaxed setting. Marcus was ecstatic, saying he knew I would make the right decision, that this was our chance to finally live well. I also invited my parents, who lived in Tucson, because I wanted them to be there when everything fell apart. They deserved to know what kind of person their youngest son really was. My mother was excited about the family reunion, saying it had been a long time since we'd all gotten together. If she had known this would be the last time our family would be complete, perhaps she wouldn't have been so excited. Sunday dawned warm and clear, a typical autumn day in Phoenix with temperatures around 85 degrees Fahrenheit. Linda and I meticulously prepared everything: hamburgers, ribs, salads, and chilled drinks in the cooler. Around noon, everyone started arriving. My parents came first, my mother bringing her famous apple pie. Marcus and Jessica arrived half an hour later in an Uber because Marcus said he wanted to drink without worrying about driving. Little Tyler came running and jumped into my arms, shouting, "Uncle Danny!" and I felt my heart clench. That innocent child was completely innocent, but his life was about to be destroyed because of his parents' selfish choices. The barbecue started like any other family gathering. My father took control of the grill, as he always did, flipping the ribs and telling old stories about when Marcus and I were kids. My mother was in the kitchen with Linda and Jessica, preparing the side dishes and laughing at some inside joke. Marcus was beside me, beer in hand, talking about how this could be one of the last barbecues before we became retired millionaires. Every word that came out of his mouth was like a knife being repeatedly plunged into my back. I had to bite the inside of my cheek to keep the smile on my face, to keep the truth that was burning inside me like acid from escaping. After we ate, while everyone was relaxed and satisfied, Marcus brought up the subject of selling the dealership again. He made it sound like it was a decision that would benefit the whole family, not just the two of us. He said we could help our parents move to a better house, that we could finally afford that trip to Europe they'd always dreamed of. My mother was emotional, her eyes filling with tears as she spoke about how proud she was of the children she had raised, how we were taking care of each other exactly as she had always taught us. I had to leave and go to the bathroom because I couldn't take it anymore. I locked the door, turned on the tap to muffle the sound, and let a few silent tears fall. Not tears of sadness, but tears of such deep anger that it was consuming me from the inside. When I returned, I found Marcus alone in the backyard, gazing at the illuminated pool while smoking a cigarette, a habit he had promised to quit years ago. I approached him, and for the first time in weeks, let a little of the truth slip out. I asked if he was absolutely sure about selling the business, if there wasn't anything he wanted to tell me before we took this gigantic step. Marcus looked at me with an expression that tried to look confused, but for a split second, I saw something different in his eyes, something like panic. But he quickly regained his composure and laughed, saying I was being paranoid, that it was just natural nervousness before a big change. He put his arm around my shoulders and said he trusted me completely, and that he hoped I trusted him the same way. The hypocrisy of those words almost made me vomit. The party ended around 8 o'clock at night. Everyone left happy, hugging and kissing each other on the cheeks, promising to see each other soon. Jessica even whispered in my ear that I was making the right choice, that Marcus was so excited he could hardly sleep at night. When the door closed behind them, and only Linda and I were left in the silent house, I sat on the sofa and finally let it all out. I didn't cry, but my whole body trembled with a mixture of anger, betrayal, and anticipation of what was about to happen. Linda sat beside me and just held my hand, saying nothing because there was nothing to say. Tomorrow would be the day. Tomorrow Marcus would discover that his actions had consequences. I didn't sleep at all that night. I lay in bed replaying everything in my head, worried that something would go wrong, that Marcus would somehow escape, that all this pain and planning would be for nothing. Around 5 in the morning, I gave up trying to sleep and went out to the backyard with a cup of coffee. The sun was beginning to rise over the mountains to the east, painting the sky orange and pink. I thought about how beautiful days like this used to fill me with hope and gratitude, but now everything seemed tainted by Marcus's betrayal. My phone vibrated with a message from Agent Morrison confirming that everything was ready. The warrants had been issued. The teams were in position. Everything would happen when Marcus arrived for work at 9 in the morning. I arrived at the dealership at 7, 2 hours earlier than usual. Tom was already there. He hadn't been able to sleep either. We sat in my office in silence, drinking coffee and waiting. Around 8:30, other employees started arriving. Everything seemed normal, just another work day, but I knew that in a matter of minutes, everything would change irreversibly. At 8:55, I saw Marcus's BMW pulling into the parking lot. He got out of the car, with that confident gait, wearing an expensive suit he'd probably bought with stolen money, greeting employees along the way. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear the blood pulsing in my ears. Marcus didn't even make it into the building. 3 black SUVs pulled into the parking lot simultaneously, blocking the exit. Federal agents emerged from the vehicles, all wearing vests with FBI emblazoned in large yellow letters. Agent Morrison and Agent Torres went straight to Marcus, who had frozen in place, the color draining from his face. I couldn't hear what they were saying from inside, but I saw them handcuff him. I saw the expression of utter shock, then anger, then something that looked like pure terror. Marcus started screaming, denying everything, saying it was a misunderstanding, that they were making a terrible mistake. But the agents were professionals. They didn't flinch. They just guided him to one of the SUVs with practiced efficiency. Across town, I knew another team of agents was doing the same thing to Jessica at their house in Scottsdale. Richard had explained that coordinated arrests were crucial to prevent one agent from warning the other and giving them time to destroy evidence. I thought of Tyler, that innocent little boy, probably being left with neighbors or social services while his parents were taken into federal custody. Part of me felt terrible for him. But then I remembered the 23 employees at the dealership who almost lost their jobs because of Marcus's greed. I remembered the nights Linda spent awake worrying about our finances. I remembered every lie my brother had told while looking me straight in the eye. After they took Marcus away, Agent Morrison went into the dealership and asked me to accompany her. There were more agents searching Marcus's office, removing computers, files, phones, anything that could contain evidence. The forensic team was photographing everything, cataloging each item. Employees were huddled in small groups, whispering amongst themselves, clearly confused and frightened. I would have to make a statement, explaining what was happening without revealing all the sordid details. Agent Morrison told me that from that moment on, the case was public. There would be media reports, customer inquiries, potential damage to the dealership's reputation. But she assured me that we had done everything right, that acting quickly had probably saved the business from complete collapse. I gathered all the employees in the showroom an hour later. I looked at those worried faces, people who trusted me to lead, to protect their jobs and families. I took a deep breath and explained that Marcus had been arrested on federal charges of fraud and embezzlement, that for months he had been diverting company money through elaborate schemes, that I had only recently discovered this and had worked with the authorities to build a case against him. The silence that followed was deafening. Some people seemed shocked, others saddened, and some, curiously, not very surprised. Tom stepped forward and confirmed everything I had said, adding that we had irrefutable evidence and that the company was fully cooperating with the authorities. An employee named Sandra, who had worked in the service department for 7 years, timidly raised her hand and asked if their jobs were safe. It was the question everyone wanted to ask, but was afraid to. I looked at her and everyone else and told the truth. I said the situation was serious, that we had lost a significant amount of money, but that I would do everything in my power to keep the dealership running, that no one would be held responsible for Marcus's actions except Marcus, that we needed to stay united and work harder than ever to overcome this. I saw some faces relax, others still looked worried, but at least now they knew the truth. Transparency was all I could offer at that moment. The rest of the day was a blur. Lawyers, federal agents, calls from reporters wanting the story. A journalist from the Arizona Republic showed up late in the afternoon, and I gave a brief statement through Richard, confirming that an employee had been arrested, but that we couldn't comment on an ongoing federal case. That night, the story was on all the local news. Dealership manager arrested for embezzling nearly $1 million. They didn't mention that the manager was my brother yet, but it was only a matter of time before someone connected the dots. I was prepared for it, or at least I thought I was. My phone started ringing at 8 o'clock at night. It was my mother. She was hysterical, crying so loudly I could barely understand what she was saying. Apparently, federal agents had come to their house in Tucson to question them about Marcus, wanting to know if they were aware of his activities or if they had received money from him recently. My father picked up the phone, and his voice was cold, controlled in a way that scared me more than my mother's screams. He asked if I knew this was going to happen. I confirmed that I did. He asked how long I had known. I said a few weeks. There was a long silence on the other end of the line, and then my father said something that cut deeper than anything. "You betrayed your own brother." Then he hung up. I stared at the phone in my hand, completely stunned. Linda had heard everything and immediately hugged me, but the damage was done. My parents were on Marcus's side. It didn't matter that he had stolen from me, that he had betrayed my trust, that he had almost destroyed everything I had built. He was the youngest son, the baby of the family, and I was the cruel older brother who had put him in jail. The injustice of it hit me like a freight train. I was the victim. I was the one who had been robbed, betrayed, used. But somehow, in my parents' eyes, I was the villain. At that moment, I realized that Marcus hadn't just stolen my money. He had stolen my entire family. The following days were the loneliest of my life. My parents refused to answer my calls. My mother sent me a single text message saying that I had shattered the family and that she needed time to process everything. Time. As if there were any amount of time that would make what Marcus had done acceptable. I tried to explain by text. I sent screenshots of bank documents, copies of emails between Marcus and Jessica planning the robberies. My mother replied only, "He's your brother. You should have resolved this as a family," as if federal fraud of almost $1 million was something that could be resolved during a Sunday dinner with pie for dessert. Linda became my only anchor to sanity. She was furious with my parents, saying they were being ridiculously blind and unfair. But I knew my parents. We grew up poor. My father worked in construction his whole life, breaking his back for minimum wage. My mother cleaned the houses of rich people for 30 years. For them, family was everything because family was all they had. The idea of handing a child over to the authorities, no matter what he had done, violated something fundamental in their belief system. I understood this intellectually. But emotionally, I felt like an abandoned child, screaming to be heard, but being completely ignored. Richard Bowman kept me updated on the legal process. Marcus and Jessica had hired a high-profile criminal defense attorney from Scottsdale, a guy named David Brenner, who had a reputation for getting wealthy people off serious charges. Marcus's bail was set at $500,000, and to my bitter surprise, my parents mortgaged their house to pay it. This meant Marcus was free, at least temporarily, while awaiting trial. Richard warned me that this was common in white-collar cases, but assured me that with the evidence we had, there was no chance Marcus would escape conviction. The question wasn't whether he would be convicted, but how long he would serve in prison. 2 weeks after his arrest, Marcus made his first public appearance. He gave an interview to Channel 12 News claiming he was innocent, that I had fabricated evidence against him because I was jealous of his success, and that the whole situation was personal revenge disguised as justice. I watched that interview in my living room and almost threw the remote at the television. There he was, wearing an impeccable suit, his hair perfectly combed, looking directly at the camera, with tears in his eyes, talking about how he had dedicated years of his life to the dealership, only to be betrayed by his own brother. The reporter completely accepted him. She asked gentle questions, letting him tell his side of the story without questioning anything. The interview changed everything. Suddenly, there were two competing narratives in the public sphere. The federal prosecutor's narrative that Marcus was a calculating fraudster, and Marcus's narrative that he was a victim of family persecution. People who didn't know the facts started taking sides. I saw comments on the dealership's social media, some supporting Marcus, saying that brothers shouldn't do that to each other, that I should have handled it internally. Others defended me, saying that crime is crime regardless of family ties. The division was almost 50% on each side, and it drove me crazy. How could anyone defend a man who had stolen almost $1 million? Sales at the dealership plummeted 40% in the first month after the arrest. Customers didn't want to do business with a company involved in a federal scandal. It didn't matter that I was the victim. The mere association with crime was enough to scare people away. I had to fire 3 employees, including Sandra, the woman who had asked about job security. Looking her in the eye while handing her the notice was one of the hardest things I've ever done. She had 2 young children and an unemployed husband. I gave her 3 months' severance pay out of my own pocket, even though the company couldn't afford it. It was the least I could do, but I felt powerless in the face of the destruction Marcus had caused. Tom came to my office one Friday afternoon with devastating news. He had been working with our accountants, trying to untangle all the financial mess Marcus had left behind, and the situation was worse than anyone had imagined. Besides the money directly embezzled, Marcus had used company credit to take out personal loans that were never repaid. He had put up collateral in the dealership's name for fraudulent investments. The total financial hole was close to $1.3 million. Tom put the papers on my desk and said something that chilled me to the bone. If we can't recover at least half of this money in the next 6 months, we're going to have to declare bankruptcy. Bankruptcy. The word hung in the air like a death sentence. I had built that dealership from scratch 15 years ago. I started with a small batch selling used cars that I fixed myself on weekends. I worked 80 hours a week for years, sacrificing vacations, time with Linda, my health, everything to make that business grow. And now, because of one person's greed, someone I loved and trusted more than anyone else in the world, everything was on the verge of collapse. I looked at Tom and asked what our options were. He sighed and said we only had one real chance: sue Marcus and Jessica civilly, get a court order freezing all their assets, and hope we could recover enough to keep the company alive. Richard was already working on it. He had filed a massive civil lawsuit against Marcus and Jessica, seeking not only the stolen $1.3 million, but also punitive damages that could triple that amount. In fraud cases, Arizona courts frequently awarded triple damages as punishment and deterrence. This meant we were potentially seeking almost $4 million. Of course, you can't get blood from a stone. If Marcus and Jessica didn't have $4 million, we wouldn't get $4 million. But Richard had obtained orders freezing all their bank accounts, placing liens on their Scottsdale home and BMW, even blocking their access to credit cards. Marcus and Jessica were financially crippled. This should have given me satisfaction, but it didn't, because while we were financially strangling Marcus, I was bleeding too. The bills kept coming. The dealership mortgage, the payments on the cars in probate, the salaries of the remaining employees, utilities, insurance, everything still needed to be paid, while our income had plummeted dramatically. I put my own house up as collateral for a $200,000 emergency loan just to keep the lights on. Linda didn't complain, but I saw the fear in her eyes. We were betting everything on a single card, that the legal system would work, that justice would prevail, that in the end we would recover enough to survive. Marcus's preliminary hearing took place 6 weeks after his arrest. It was a cold Monday in November, and the federal courthouse in downtown Phoenix was packed. There were reporters, curious onlookers, and surprisingly, a small group of Marcus's supporters holding signs saying things like, "Families must forgive" and "Justice is not revenge." I felt nauseous when I saw those signs. These people had no idea what they had been through. They hadn't lost their life savings, their businesses, their families. To them, this was just entertainment, a drama they could observe from afar and make simplistic moral judgments without understanding the brutal complexity of the situation. I entered the courtroom with Linda on one side and Richard on the other. My parents were there, seated next to Marcus. As we passed them, I tried to make eye contact with my mother, but she turned her face away. My father looked at me with an expression of pure disappointment that cut deeper than any words could. I sat next to the prosecutor, physically only a few feet away from my parents, but emotionally the distance was insurmountable. Marcus entered wearing a conservative grey suit, handcuffed but walking with his head held high. He looked directly at me as he passed, and for a second our eyes met. There was no remorse there. There were no apologies. Just cold, pure anger. The federal prosecutor, a man named James Callahan, presented a devastating summary of the case. He outlined every fraudulent transaction, every shell company, every documented lie. He presented emails where Marcus literally laughed about how easy it was to fool him, text messages where Jessica celebrated finally being able to buy expensive designer handbags without worrying about money. David Brenner, Marcus's lawyer, did what he could. He argued that the evidence was circumstantial, that many of the transactions had legitimate explanations, that the prosecution was exaggerating the case for headlines. But even Brenner seemed to know he was fighting a losing battle. The evidence was simply overwhelming. At the end of the hearing, the judge, a stern woman in her 60s named the Honorable Margaret Steinberg, denied Brenner's request to dismiss the charges. She set a trial date, March 15th, 4 months later. Marcus would be tried on 23 federal charges of fraud, embezzlement, and money laundering. If convicted on all counts, he faced up to 30 years in federal prison. When the hearing ended and we were leaving the courthouse, something unexpected happened. My mother blocked my path at the door. She was crying, her mask blurred, her hands trembling. For a second, I thought she was finally going to hug me, tell me she understood, that she forgave me for doing what I had to do. Instead, she looked at me with a mixture of pain and anger and said, "You destroyed this family, Daniel. I hope you can live with that." Then she turned and left, leaving me frozen in the cold marble hallway of the federal courthouse, surrounded by strangers, more alone than I had ever been in my life. Linda gently pulled me aside, and we stepped out into the harsh Arizona sun that suddenly seemed too blinding, too hot, too unreal. The weeks following the preliminary hearing were a special kind of hell. I had prepared myself to face Marcus, to deal with the legal and financial consequences, but I hadn't prepared myself to be treated like the villain of the story by my own family. My mother blocked my phone number. My father sent a registered letter saying I was no longer welcome in their home, that they had lost a son when Marcus was arrested, and didn't intend to lose another by maintaining contact with me. The letter was handwritten in my father's trembling handwriting, and every word seemed to have been written with physical pain. I kept that letter in a drawer in my office because part of me couldn't believe it was real, that my own parents had disowned me for refusing to be robbed. Linda tried to comfort me by saying that eventually they would understand, that when the trial was over and Marcus was convicted, the reality of what he had done would become undeniable. But I wasn't so sure. I had seen families destroyed over less. I had seen parents choose sides, create narratives to justify their loyalties, and cling to those narratives even in the face of overwhelming evidence to the contrary. My mother had constructed a story in her head where Marcus was a victim of my ambitions, where my success had made him feel inferior, where anything he had done was an understandable response to the pressure I supposedly put on him. It was an absurd story, but she needed that story to sleep at night. The dealership continued to struggle to survive. We implemented drastic cuts, eliminated all non-essential expenses, and renegotiated contracts with suppliers. Tom worked miracles, keeping our creditors at bay while we promised payments as soon as we recovered the stolen funds. But it was like trying to hold water in your hands. Each week, a little more slipped through your fingers. In December, we had our worst month in 10 years, selling only 14 cars when we normally sold at least 40. I sat in my office on Christmas Eve, alone, because I had given all the employees the day off, looking at piles of overdue bills and wondering if Marcus had finally achieved what he apparently wanted, my complete destruction. Christmas was depressing in a way I never thought possible. Linda and I stayed home, just the two of us, trying to make a festive meal, but both knowing our minds were elsewhere. My parents were in Tucson with Marcus, Jessica, and Tyler, having a family celebration from which I was excluded. Linda showed me a picture her cousin had seen on Facebook. The whole family gathered around the Christmas tree, Marcus smiling as if he didn't have a care in the world, as if he wasn't awaiting a federal trial that could send him to prison for decades. My mother was beside him, with her arm around his shoulders, protective, defiant. The message was clear. They had chosen a side, and it wasn't mine. Right after the New Year, Richard Bowman called me with news that was both good and terrible. Federal investigators had uncovered more evidence. Marcus hadn't just stolen from the dealership. He was operating a parallel scheme where he used customer information to open fraudulent credit cards in their names. At least 15 of the dealership's customers had been victims of identity theft, and all the traces led back to Marcus. This added new federal charges to the case, including identity theft and mail fraud, crimes that carried even harsher penalties. Richard said this practically guaranteed a heavy sentence, but it also meant more negative exposure for the dealership. When those customers discovered their information had been compromised at our establishment, there would be lawsuits, claims, possibly even an FTC investigation. I had to make personal calls to each of those 15 clients. They were the most difficult conversations of my professional life. Some people yelled at me, blamed me for not having better security systems, for hiring a criminal. Others were surprisingly understanding, especially when I explained that the criminal was my own brother and that I was also a victim. A lady named Margaret Chen, who had bought a Honda Accord from us 2 years earlier, started crying on the phone. She said that identity theft had ruined her credit, that she had been denied a mortgage she had been trying to get for years. I offered to pay for credit monitoring services for her and everyone else affected, even if it cost an additional $20,000 that I didn't have. It was the right thing to do, even if it sank me even further. In mid-January, I received an unexpected call. It was Jessica. She was using an unknown number, probably a prepaid phone, since all her phones had been confiscated as evidence. Her voice was broken, almost unrecognizable. She said she needed to talk to me, that she had important things to tell me, but she couldn't do it over the phone. She wanted to meet in person, somewhere public. Every instinct told me to refuse, to hang up and never look back. But curiosity, and perhaps a desperate hope that she might provide information that would help my case, made me agree. We arranged to meet at a Starbucks in Tempe, far from both the dealership and her house, at a busy time where there would be witnesses if something went wrong. Jessica arrived looking completely different from the confident, well-dressed woman she used to be. She had lost a drastic amount of weight, had deep, dark circles under her eyes. Her hair was lifeless and pulled back in a messy ponytail. She wore simple Target clothes that didn't match. She sat down across from me, her hands trembling around a coffee she hadn't even tried to drink. For long minutes she said nothing, just stared at the table as if gathering courage. Finally, she looked up and her first words were, "I'm so sorry, Daniel. I'm so sorry for everything." And then she started to cry. Not gently, but in loud, ugly sobs that made other people in the cafe look in our direction. I let her cry until she calmed down a bit. I didn't offer comfort, but I also didn't get up to leave. When she was able to speak again, the story she told recontextualized everything. Jessica said the fraud scheme wasn't Marcus's idea, it had been hers. She had grown up poor like us, had spent her whole life seeing rich people and desperately wanting to be one of them. When she married Marcus, she became frustrated because even working at a good dealership, they were still middle class, still had to worry about bills, still couldn't buy the things she saw her friends posting on Instagram. It was she who suggested that Marcus start diverting small amounts, just enough to improve their lifestyle a little. Marcus resisted at first, but she insisted, manipulated him, said I would never notice, that I had so much money it wouldn't make a difference. Jessica continued, the words flowing in a cathartic stream. He said that once they started, it was like a drug. Each success made them bolder, more reckless. She bought expensive jewelry, designer clothes, took Marcus to restaurants where a meal cost more than most people earned in a week. He expressed concern sometimes, saying they needed to stop before they got caught, but she always convinced him to keep going just a little longer, just until they had enough to never have to worry about money again. The house in Scottsdale had been the pinnacle of her greed. She wanted to prove to herself and the world that she had made it, that she was no longer the poor girl from Yuma who grew up in a trailer. And Marcus, because he loved her, or because he was weak, or both, gave her everything she wanted using my money. But now, Jessica said, everything had fallen apart in ways she never imagined. Marcus blamed her for everything, saying she had forced him to commit the crimes, that he was merely a victim of her manipulations. Their relationship was destroyed. They barely spoke. Tyler was having nightmares, wetting the bed, clearly traumatized by the constant tension and dramatic changes in their lives. Jessica's parents had cut off all contact when they found out what she had done, saying they had raised her better than this. She was living in a tiny, one-bedroom apartment that Marcus's parents were paying for, eating food from food banks, unable to work, because any money she earned would be immediately confiscated by the court. Her life, she said, had become the hell she deserved. I asked her why she was telling me all this. She wiped away her tears and looked directly into my eyes for the first time. She said her lawyer had offered her a deal with the prosecution. If she testified against Marcus, admitted her guilt completely, and agreed to cooperate with authorities to trace every stolen penny, they would reduce her charges. Instead of facing 20 years, she might get maybe 5 years with the possibility of parole after 3. Her lawyer strongly recommended she accept the deal, but she wanted to tell me personally before doing so. She wanted me to know she was genuinely sorry, that if she could go back and undo everything, she would in a second. She didn't expect forgiveness, she said, but she needed me to know the whole truth before the trial turned everything into a circus of competing lies. I sat there processing everything she had said. Part of me wanted to yell at her, tell her that her regret came too late, that apologies wouldn't return the $1.3 million, or fix my relationship with my parents, or save the jobs of the people I had fired. But another part of me recognized that at least she was taking responsibility in a way Marcus never did. She wasn't blaming others or making up elaborate excuses. She was admitting that she had been greedy, selfish, and destructive. That didn't erase what she did, but it was something. I finally told her that she should accept the deal, that cooperating was the least she could do, and that if she truly cared about Tyler, putting Marcus in prison where he belonged was the only way to perhaps give this boy a chance to grow up with at least one parent eventually free. Jessica nodded, wiped her face with a napkin, and said she would do it. Then she slid a brown envelope across the table. She said it contained everything she had managed to gather about Marcus's finances, information that even federal investigators hadn't yet found. Offshore bank accounts, cryptocurrency investments, even physical cash hidden in safe deposit boxes in 3 different cities. If I handed this over to the authorities, they could recover significantly more of the stolen funds. I took the envelope, heavy with documents, and looked at her questioningly. Why was she doing this? She gave a sad smile and said, "Because even if Marcus never admits it, we destroyed you. And destroying you destroyed our entire family, including my son. If I can help fix even a piece of this, I have to try." It was the most honest thing anyone had said to me in months. After Jessica left, I sat in that Starbucks for another hour, the envelope in front of me, my mind racing. I opened it and leafed through the documents. There were bank statements from accounts in the Cayman Islands, records of Bitcoin transactions totaling over $400,000, even photos of receipts from safe deposit boxes in Las Vegas, San Diego, and Denver. If all of this was legitimate, we could potentially recover over $800,000, maybe even the full amount. This would save the dealership. This would save me. I grabbed my phone and called Richard immediately. He told me to take the documents directly to his office, not to go home, not to talk to anyone about it. This information was dynamite, and it needed to be handled with extreme care. Richard Bowman examined the documents Jessica had given me with the intensity of a surgeon studying a critical X-ray. He put on reading glasses, made meticulous notes, and occasionally sighed or murmured something inaudible. After nearly 40 minutes of silence, he finally took off his glasses, rubbed his tired eyes, and said that this changed everything. The information Jessica provided was pure gold in legal terms. She had documented not only where Marcus had hidden the money, but also how he had moved funds through multiple jurisdictions, specifically to avoid detection. This added new charges of international money laundering to his case, crimes the FBI took extremely seriously. Richard said that with this evidence, Marcus would likely face at least 15 years in federal prison without the possibility of parole. Agent Morrison and Agent Torres arrived at Richard's office within 2 hours of him contacting them. They went through all the documents with that quiet efficiency that characterized experienced professionals. Agent Morrison looked at me at one point and said that Jessica had just become their star witness. With her testimony and this documentary evidence, they wouldn't need a trial anymore. They could pressure Marcus so hard that he would have no choice but to accept a plea deal. This meant the case would be resolved faster, less prolonged negative publicity for the dealership, and most importantly, a much better chance of recovering the assets before Marcus found a way to hide them even deeper. But there was a complication. Agent Torres explained that if Marcus found out Jessica had turned against him, there was a chance he might do something desperate. Cornered people often made fatal mistakes, and Marcus had already demonstrated a capacity for dishonest and manipulative behavior. They wanted to establish discreet surveillance on Marcus, monitoring his communications and movements until they were ready to make their move. This would take a few more weeks, but it would be safer for everyone involved, including Jessica and Tyler. I agreed, although each day of waiting felt like an eternity when you're bleeding money and trying to keep a business afloat. I returned to the dealership that afternoon, feeling for the first time in months like there was light at the end of the tunnel. Tom immediately noticed the change in my demeanor and asked what had happened. I closed the office door and told him everything about the meeting with Jessica, the documents, the fact that we would probably recover most of the stolen money. Tom literally let his legs give way and had to sit down. He had been carrying the weight of this crisis as much as I had, working late every night, dealing with aggressive creditors, juggling bills to keep the lights on. Hearing that there was genuine hope of recovery made something break in him. He put his head in his hands and just breathed deeply for several minutes, composing himself. But we couldn't tell anyone yet. That was the strict order from the federal agents. If the information leaked, Marcus could be alerted and take steps to hide the remaining assets or flee altogether. So Tom and I had to keep pretending that all was lost, that we were just fighting to survive a few more months before the inevitable collapse. It was torture, keeping good news a secret, especially when I saw the worried faces of the remaining employees, people who woke up every day, not knowing if they would still have jobs the following week. But operational security was critical. One slip could ruin everything. Meanwhile, Marcus continued his public relations campaign. He gave another interview, this time to the Arizona Republic, where he doubled down on the victim narrative. He claimed that I had always resented the fact that he was more charismatic, better with clients, more naturally talented in sales, that I had fabricated this whole affair because I couldn't accept that my younger brother could be better than me at something. The interview even included quotes from my parents supporting his version. My mother saying that I had always been the jealous son. My father saying that Marcus would never have done something like that without extreme provocation. Seeing those words printed in black and white, my own parents publicly defaming me, was like being repeatedly stabbed. Linda was so furious about the article that she wrote a letter to the editor of the Arizona Republic explaining the truth, including details about the federal evidence, the stolen assets, and the impact on innocent employees. The newspaper published the letter a week later, and it generated its own wave of response. Some people commented in support, others attacked us for airing our dirty laundry in public. One particularly cruel commenter said that clearly the entire Carter family was dysfunctional and that we all deserved the suffering we were experiencing. Reading that, seeing our family pain turned into entertainment for strangers to judge and comment on, made me question if there was any limit to how low this situation could sink. In February, Agent Morrison called me with an update. They had been monitoring Marcus's communications under a federal warrant and had intercepted several troubling conversations. Marcus was trying to contact people in Mexico, apparently exploring the possibility of fleeing across the border before trial. He had also done extensive online research on countries without extradition treaties with the United States. His behavior indicated someone planning an escape, not someone confident in his innocence. Agent Morrison said they needed to accelerate the timeline. They couldn't risk Marcus disappearing. The plan now was to confront him the following week with all the new evidence and force a plea deal immediately. She asked me if I wanted to be there when they confronted Marcus, not in the actual room, but in an adjacent office where I could watch through mirrored glass and hear everything through an audio system. It was an opportunity to see my brother finally forced to face the reality of what he had done, without the public performance, without the mask. Part of me desperately wanted to be there. I wanted to see the exact moment he realized he had lost. But another part of me, the still human part that remembered growing up sharing a room with him, feared that watching his complete destruction would somehow destroy me too. It took me 2 days to decide, but I finally told Agent Morrison I would be there. I needed closure, and that moment would be the closest I could get. The confrontation was scheduled for Tuesday at 2 in the afternoon at the federal office in downtown Phoenix. I arrived early with Richard Bowman. They led us to a small room with uncomfortable chairs and that mirrored glass you see on police shows on TV. From our side, it looked like a normal mirror, but we could perfectly see the interrogation room on the other side. It was Spartan, just a metal table, some chairs, undecorated grey walls. There was a camera in the corner recording everything. Agent Morrison and Agent Torres went in first, preparing paperwork, testing recording equipment. Then an officer brought Marcus in. Seeing my brother walk into that room in handcuffs was surreal. He was wearing casual clothes, jeans and a polo shirt, but they looked way too big on him. Marcus had lost weight, just like Jessica, the effects of stress evident in his gaunt face and sunken eyes. But when he looked around the room, there was still that defensive arrogance in his posture, that refusal to appear defeated. The officers removed the handcuffs, and he rubbed his wrists dramatically before sitting down. Agent Morrison began by explaining that they had significant new evidence and that this would be his last opportunity to cooperate before the case went to trial. Marcus crossed his arms and said he had nothing to confess because he hadn't done anything wrong. Agent Torres slid a folder across the table. He told Marcus to open it. When Marcus opened it and began to leaf through it, I saw the color drain completely from his face. It was the documents Jessica had provided, copies of bank statements from the Cayman Islands, Bitcoin transaction records, photos of the safe deposit boxes. Marcus looked up. His arrogance evaporated, replaced by something close to pure panic. He asked where they got it, his voice breaking slightly. Agent Morrison smiled coldly and said they had a cooperative witness who was providing detailed information on every aspect of his fraudulent operation. A witness who knew every account, every transaction, every lie. Marcus wasn't stupid. He understood immediately that the only person who could have that information was Jessica. Watching my brother fall apart was both satisfying and devastating. He started rambling, trying to invent explanations, saying those accounts were legitimate investments, that the money came from other sources, that there had been misunderstandings. But Agent Torres cut him off coldly, outlining exactly how each transaction traced back to the diverted funds from the dealership. They had forensic experts who could follow money through any number of layers of obfuscation. Marcus had no way out. Agent Morrison then put the offer on the table. If Marcus confessed fully, provided access to all remaining assets, and agreed to return everything he could, the prosecution would recommend 12 years instead of 20 or more. He would still go to prison for a long time, but it would be a sentence that would let him out while he was still relatively young. Marcus remained silent for a long time, his head bowed, shoulders hunched. I could see tears falling onto his lap, though he made no sound. Finally, he looked up and asked if Jessica was also accepting a deal. Agent Morrison confirmed that she was, that she had already signed her confession and was fully cooperating. Marcus laughed, a bitter, broken laugh, and said of course she was, that Jessica always knew how to take care of herself first. Then he asked something that caught me off guard. He asked if I was watching from somewhere. Agent Torres neither confirmed nor denied it, only said that it didn't matter, that the only thing that mattered now was Marcus's decision on how to proceed. There was another long silence. Then Marcus began to speak, and this time there was no acting, no charm, no lies. He said he had envied my success since we were teenagers, that when I started the dealership and it thrived while he jumped from job to job without getting anywhere, the envy turned to resentment. When I hired him, instead of feeling grateful, he felt humiliated, as if it were charity, as if I were rubbing my success in his face. When Jessica started pushing for a better lifestyle, he saw an opportunity not only to give her what she wanted, but to take from me what I had. It wasn't just about money, Marcus admitted. It was about finally being the successful brother, the one with the nice house and the expensive car and the life of luxury. It was about proving that he wasn't the failure he always felt he was. Hearing that confession hit me like a punch to the gut. Part of me always knew there had to be something emotional behind Marcus's actions, that no one betrays their family out of sheer greed. But hearing him admit to years of envy and resentment, hearing that every kindness I had shown was seen as an insult, was devastating in a way I hadn't expected. Marcus went on to say that he knew what he had done was wrong, that especially when he started stealing clients' identities, he had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. But at that point, he was so deep in that the only option seemed to be to continue, to steal enough to disappear, to start over somewhere where no one knew his name or his flaws. Agent Morrison gave Marcus time to compose himself, then pushed a document across the table. It was the plea agreement. 12 years in federal prison, full restitution of all stolen funds, full cooperation with authorities in exchange for a reduced sentence recommendation. Marcus picked up the pen with a trembling hand and signed without reading the details. When he finished, Agent Torres took the document and said that Marcus would be officially prosecuted the next day, with the confession becoming part of the public record. His lawyer would be notified and could be present for the proceedings. Marcus simply nodded, looking completely defeated, a shell of the confident man who had entered that room less than an hour before. When Marcus was led away from that interrogation room, handcuffed again, and with his head bowed, I felt a confusing mix of emotions that I couldn't fully process. There was satisfaction in knowing that he had finally admitted everything, that the truth was officially recorded and could no longer be contested. But there was also a deep and irreparable sadness because the man being taken away was my brother, the person with whom I shared my entire childhood, and no matter what he had done, part of me still remembered the little boy who used to follow me everywhere, calling me a hero. Richard put his hand on my shoulder and said I should feel relieved that this was justice being served. But justice, I discovered at that moment, is cold and empty when it comes at the cost of destroying your own family. We left the federal building into the bright afternoon light of Phoenix. Linda was waiting in the parking lot. She had refused to go inside, saying she couldn't bear to witness it without collapsing. When he saw me, he ran and hugged me tightly, and it was only then that I realized he was trembling. We stayed there for several minutes, just holding on to each other while people passed by, looking curiously. Finally, we got in the car, and I drove aimlessly for a while, just needing to move, to do something, not to think. We ended up at Papago Park, parked near the red rock formations, and sat in silence as the sun began to set on the horizon, painting everything in gold and orange. Linda finally broke her silence. She said that now we could begin to rebuild, that with Marcus confessing and the assets being recovered, the dealership would survive, our finances would stabilize, and eventually all of this would be just a painful memory. But I knew she was wrong. Some things, once broken, can't be completely fixed. My relationship with my parents was destroyed, probably irreparably. The dealership's reputation was tarnished in a way that would take years to overcome. And something inside me, some basic capacity to trust people, had been fundamentally damaged. How do you regain trust after discovering that the person closest to you spent years plotting your destruction? News of Marcus's confession spread quickly. The next day, it was in all the local newspapers and even caught some national attention because the story had all the elements the media loves: family betrayal, large-scale fraud, courtroom drama. The Arizona Republic published a detailed article titled "Dealership Manager Confesses to Stealing Over $1 Million from His Own Brother." The article included details of the confession, the multiple charges, and mentioned that both Marcus and Jessica would face significant prison time. Finally, the public narrative was aligned with the truth. But reading that article didn't give me the satisfaction I thought it would. It only made me feel exhausted and sad. My parents still hadn't contacted me. I knew they must have seen the news. They must know now that Marcus had confessed, that everything I'd said was true. But their silence continued, heavy and accusatory. Linda suggested I try calling, that maybe now that the truth was undeniable, they would be ready to talk. I tried 3 times over the course of a week. Each time my father answered and hung up immediately when he recognized my voice. On the 3rd attempt, he stayed on the line long enough to say, "You still put your brother in prison. Nothing changes that." Then he hung up. I realized at that moment that my parents had made a choice, and no amount of evidence or truth was going to change that. They preferred to believe I was the villain, because the alternative, accepting that Marcus was fundamentally flawed, was too painful. With Marcus's confession, federal agents began the process of recovering the hidden assets. They managed to access offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands, although the legal process was complicated and involved international cooperation. Bitcoin was simpler. Once they had the wallet keys, they could transfer everything into federal custody. Safe deposit boxes in Las Vegas, San Diego, and Denver were opened with warrants, revealing nearly $340,000 in cash, along with jewelry, luxury watches, and other valuables. In total, they managed to locate approximately $920,000 in recoverable assets. It wasn't the total amount stolen, but it was significantly more than anyone initially expected to recover. Richard filed motions in civil court to have those assets transferred to me as restitution. The process would take months, he warned me, because there were complex legal procedures regarding how recovered criminal assets are distributed. But he was confident that eventually I would receive most of that money. Meanwhile, the Scottsdale house that Marcus and Jessica bought was put up for auction. She sold it for $850,000, and after paying off the remaining mortgage, she had about $480,000 left, which would also come to me. Tom and I sat one night doing the math. With approximately $1.4 million in total expected restitution over the next 6 to 8 months, we could pay off all the overdue debts, rehire the employees we had to lay off, invest in marketing to rebuild the dealership's reputation, and still have a decent emergency fund. We wouldn't come out of this situation profitable. Almost 2 years of potential revenue and incalculable brand damage had been lost. But we would survive. Carter Auto Sales would continue to exist. Tom raised his beer in a mournful toast, saying he never thought celebrating mere survival would be the best outcome we could hope for. We clinked bottles and drank in silence, 2 men who had aged 10 years in 10 months. Sentencing hearings for Marcus and Jessica were scheduled for May, 3 months after their confessions. Meanwhile, both remained on probation with electronic monitoring via ankle bracelet, severe travel restrictions, and a ban on accessing any financial accounts. Jessica was living with an aunt in Mesa, working part-time at a coffee shop under a false name, because her real name had become widely known in the news. Marcus was at my parents' house in Tucson, apparently spending his days watching TV and helping my father with gardening. The image of Marcus mowing my parents' lawn while awaiting sentencing to over a decade in federal prison was almost comical in its sadness. I received a letter from Marcus 6 weeks before sentencing. It came in the regular mail, my name and address written in that handwriting I knew so well from years of birthday cards and quick notes. I held the envelope for an hour before I could open it. The letter was 3 pages long, handwritten on both sides. Marcus began by saying that he didn't expect forgiveness and wasn't asking for it. But he wanted me to know that he now understood completely what he had done. That the last few weeks living with our parents and seeing their suffering, knowing that he had caused not only my pain, but theirs as well, had finally broken through the denial and rationalization he had been living in. Marcus wrote about growing up always feeling like the second best, the brother who wasn't as smart, wasn't as hardworking, wasn't as successful. He said that didn't justify anything, but perhaps it explained how he got to a place where betraying his own family seemed acceptable. He wrote about Jessica, about how their relationship had been toxic from the start, feeding off the worst parts of each other, creating a spiral of materialism and greed that consumed them both. He expressed remorse, especially about Tyler, about how that innocent little boy would now grow up with both parents in prison during his formative years, how that would shape his entire life in ways no one could have predicted. The part of the letter that hit me hardest was near the end. Marcus wrote, "You'll probably never believe this, but I loved you, Danny. I still love you, even knowing you can never love me back after what I did. You were my hero when we were kids. When we grew up and you succeeded, part of me was proud, but a bigger part was destroyed because it meant I would always just be the loser brother of the successful guy. I should have worked to be better. Instead, I worked to bring you down. And now I've lost everything. My freedom, my family, my son, and worst of all, I've lost my brother. If I could do it all over again, I would do it differently. But I can't. So all I can do is say I'm sorry and hope that someday, maybe years in the future, you can think of me without utter hatred." I read that letter 5 times, each time searching for signs of manipulation, of attempts to evoke sympathy he didn't deserve. But it seemed genuine in a way his public apologies never were. Linda read it over my shoulder, and when she finished, she was silently crying. She said Marcus finally understood what he'd lost, but that understanding came too late to save anything. I folded the letter carefully and put it in a drawer. I didn't reply. There was nothing to say that would change anything, but I didn't throw it away either. Some part of me, the part that still remembered growing up sharing a tiny room and dreaming together about escaping poverty, couldn't destroy those words. Mother's Day arrived amidst all of this, and it was brutally difficult. Normally, I would take Linda to visit my mother, bring flowers and a gift, and we would spend the day together. This year, I wasn't invited. Linda suggested we send flowers anyway, a gesture of goodwill. I ordered a beautiful arrangement of pink roses, my mother's favorite, with a simple card that read, "Thinking of you. Love you, Daniel." The flowers were delivered Sunday morning. 3 hours later, I received a photo via text message from an unknown number. It was a picture of the flowers in the trash can on my parents' sidewalk. There was no message accompanying the photo. There didn't need to be. The message was crystal clear. Marcus's sentencing hearing was scheduled for a Monday morning in mid-May. The federal courthouse was packed with reporters, curious onlookers, and some of the victims whose identities Marcus had stolen. I was seated in the front row on the prosecution's side, with Linda next to me and Richard Bowman on the other. Across the aisle, my parents sat directly behind Marcus and his lawyer. My mother wore a black dress as if she were going to a funeral, which I suppose she was in a way. My father wore a suit he probably hadn't worn in 10 years, slightly tight and smelling of mothballs. They didn't glance in my direction once, keeping their eyes fixed on the back of Marcus' head as if willpower could somehow change the outcome. Judge Steinberg entered, and everyone stood. She was an imposing woman, even in her short stature, with that natural authority that comes from decades on the bench. She began by methodically reviewing the case, the charges, the confession, the evidence presented. Then she invited prosecutor James Callahan to make his statement. Callahan stood and presented a devastating argument about why Marcus deserved the maximum sentence allowed under federal guidelines. He spoke about the premeditation, the sophistication of the scheme, the abuse of family trust, the impact on innocent victims. Callahan brought forward 3 of the clients whose identities had been stolen. An elderly woman named Dorothy Williams spoke through tears about how the identity theft ruined her credit and prevented her from refinancing her home, almost resulting in foreclosure. A young man named Kevin Marsh explained how discovering someone had opened 7 credit cards in his name destroyed his chances of getting a loan to start his own business, a dream he had been working toward for 5 years. Margaret Chen, the woman I had spoken to on the phone months earlier, stood in front of the courtroom and looked directly at Marcus as she described how her denied mortgage application forced her to continue renting a small apartment with her 3 children, as her children still shared rooms because she couldn't provide them with a proper home. Marcus kept his head down throughout these testimonies, but I saw his shoulders trembling. He was crying, though silently, and part of me wondered if they were genuine tears of remorse or just fear of what was to come. Then it was the defense attorney, David Brenner's, turn to present mitigating arguments. Brenner did his best with a terrible hand. He spoke about Marcus's difficult childhood, about growing up in poverty, about feelings of inadequacy that haunted him throughout his life. He brought a psychologist who testified that Marcus suffered from narcissistic personality disorder and chronic depression, conditions that supposedly impaired his judgment. My parents were called to testify on Marcus's behalf. My mother could barely speak through sobs, saying that Marcus was a good son who had made terrible mistakes, but that he deserved a second chance, that prison would completely destroy him. My father, with a more controlled but equally emotional voice, pleaded with the judge to show mercy, saying that they had already effectively lost one son and could not bear to lose another. Hearing my parents plead for mercy for Marcus while continuing to treat me as if I didn't exist was surreal and painful in ways I couldn't put into words. They were there begging for compassion for the man who had committed multiple federal crimes, who had stolen nearly $1.5 million, who had ruined lives. But when I, the victim, tried to talk to them, I was completely rejected. The hypocrisy was stunning, but also understandable in a twisted way. Marcus was going to prison. I wasn't. In their minds, he needed their support more than I did. It was flawed logic, but it was the logic they had chosen to live by. Then came my turn. Judge Steinberg called me to make a victim impact statement. I walked to the podium on legs that felt like lead. I had rehearsed what I was going to say dozens of times, but now that I was there, with all those eyes on me, the prepared words seemed inadequate. I looked at Judge Steinberg, then at Marcus, then at my parents. I took a deep breath and began to speak. I talked about building the dealership from scratch, about working 80 hours a week for years to create something that could support not only my family, but the families of more than 20 employees. I talked about giving Marcus a chance when he was at rock bottom, about trusting him completely because he was my brother and family was everything. I described the devastation of discovering the betrayal, not just financially, but emotionally. I explained how Marcus hadn't just stolen money, but had stolen years of my life that would now be spent rebuilding instead of growing. I spoke about the employees I had to fire, about Sandra and her children, about Tom working himself to exhaustion, trying to save the business. I mentioned the sleepless nights, the anxiety attacks, the marriage strained almost to the breaking point. Then I spoke about the most painful cost of all, the loss of my family. I said that Marcus hadn't just robbed me financially, he had robbed me of my parents, had turned people I loved against me, had poisoned relationships I thought were unbreakable. My voice broke when I got to the final part. I said that forgiving Marcus was something I wasn't yet sure I was capable of doing, but that understanding the consequences of his actions was essential. I wasn't asking for revenge, I told the judge. I was asking for justice, proportionate to the harm caused. Marcus had made deliberate, calculated choices, sustained over years. He had had countless opportunities to stop, to confess, to do the right thing. Instead, he doubled down repeatedly, expanding his crimes, harming more people, and then lying about everything when he was finally caught. A sentence that reflected the seriousness of these crimes wasn't cruelty, it was necessity. I finished by saying that my brother needed to face the full consequences of his actions, not because I hated him, but because true justice demanded nothing less. When I finished and returned to my seat, the silence in the courtroom was absolute. Linda took my hand and squeezed it tightly. I glanced at my parents and saw my mother wiping away tears, but the expression on her face wasn't one of sympathy or understanding. It was anger. Anger directed at me. Somehow, even after hearing everything I had been through, she still saw me as the aggressor, not the victim. That realization, finally understanding that I would never have my parents back no matter what happened, was liberating in a way. I stopped waiting for something that would never come. I stopped needing their approval or understanding. They had made their choice, and I had to make peace with it or let it destroy me. Jessica's sentencing hearing took place immediately afterward, as both cases were related. Jessica entered the courtroom looking fragile and frightened, a stark contrast to the confident woman who used to flaunt expensive jewelry at family dinners. Her lawyer presented the plea deal she had negotiated, 5 years with the possibility of parole after 3, in exchange for full cooperation and testimony against Marcus. The prosecutor confirmed that Jessica had fulfilled her part of the agreement, providing crucial evidence and testifying honestly about every aspect of the scheme. Judge Steinberg reviewed the terms and asked Jessica direct questions about whether she understood that she was waiving her right to a trial and accepting full responsibility for her actions. Jessica responded in a clear but emotional voice that yes, she understood completely, and that she accepted full responsibility. Then she asked permission to make a statement. The judge granted it, and Jessica turned to look directly at me for the first time since entering the courtroom. She said that no excuse could undo what she had done, but she wanted me to know that the weight of guilt was something she would carry for the rest of her life. She said she had been consumed by greed and materialism to the point of losing all moral perspective, that she had destroyed not only my life and business, but also her own family, especially her son, who would now grow up knowing that both parents were convicted criminals. Jessica said she would use her time in prison to become a better person, to educate herself, to find a way to eventually contribute positively to society when she was released. Then Jessica did something unexpected. She looked toward where my parents were sitting and said she hoped they would eventually see that I wasn't the enemy, that I had only done what anyone would have done upon discovering they were being robbed, that blaming the victimized son instead of the son who committed the crimes was unfair and destructive. My mother turned red with anger, but my father put his hand on her arm, keeping her seated. Jessica then turned back to the judge and said she was ready to accept whatever sentence the court deemed appropriate. I sat there stunned. Jessica, the woman who had been Marcus's co-conspirator, who had spent my stolen money on designer handbags and jewelry, was defending me to my own parents. The irony was almost absurd. Judge Steinberg announced a 1-hour recess before delivering the sentences. I left the courtroom and went to a nearby cafe with Linda and Richard. None of us said much. We were all emotionally exhausted, just waiting for it to be over. Richard said that based on the arguments, he expected Marcus to get between 10 and 15 years, and that Jessica would likely receive exactly what the plea bargain specified. These sentences would mean Marcus would be released from prison in his late 40s or early 50s, having essentially lost his entire productive adult life. Jessica would be released around 35, still young enough to rebuild, but with a federal criminal record that would make almost everything more difficult. Tyler would be in high school when either parent was released. The ripples of their actions would extend for decades. We returned to the courtroom and waited. Finally, Judge Steinberg returned, and everyone stood. She began with Marcus, methodically reviewing the federal sentencing guidelines, the aggravating and mitigating factors, the nature of the crimes. Then she delivered the sentence. 14 years in federal prison without the possibility of parole, followed by 3 years of supervised release and full restitution of $147,000 plus interest and penalties. Marcus staggered when he heard the numbers, his lawyer having to steady him. My mother let out a sharp cry and began sobbing uncontrollably. My father just sat there with his head in his hands, shoulders trembling. 14 years. Marcus would enter prison at 33 and leave at 47, having lost what should have been the best years of his life. For Jessica, the judge upheld the terms of the plea agreement, 5 years, with the possibility of parole after 3, supervised release, and shared restitution with Marcus. Jessica accepted the sentence with a silent nod, without a dramatic display of emotion. She knew she was receiving a relatively generous deal considering the magnitude of the crimes, and she had the wisdom to accept it graciously. Both would be taken into custody immediately, processed through the federal prison system, and assigned to appropriate facilities in the coming weeks. Marcus would likely be sent to a medium-security federal prison somewhere in the southwest. Jessica would go to a women's facility, possibly in Dublin, California, or Victorville. Watching Marcus being led out of the courthouse in handcuffs for the last time was surreal. He turned one last time before passing through the security doors, and our eyes met for a split second. There was no anger there, no defiance, just deep sadness and acceptance. Then he disappeared through the doors, and I knew I probably wouldn't see him again for many years, maybe never. My parents rushed out of the courthouse without looking back, my mother still crying uncontrollably, my father trying to comfort her as he guided her out. I stood there in the cold marble hallway for a long time, just processing the fact that it was really over. The legal battle was over. Marcus was going to prison. Justice had been served. But why did I feel so empty? Linda drove me home because I was too shaken to drive. On the way, my phone started vibrating with messages. Reporters wanting statements, acquaintances offering support or judgment depending on which side they had taken, some of the dealership employees sending messages of solidarity. I turned my phone off completely. I couldn't handle any more input, any more opinions, any more reactions. When we got home, I went straight to my room, locked myself in, and for the first time since it all started almost a year before, I truly cried. Not silent tears, but deep, convulsive sobs that came from somewhere in the core of my being. I cried for the loss of my brother, for the destruction of my family, for the years stolen from my life, for everything that could have been but never would be. In the weeks following the sentencing, I began the long process of trying to rebuild some semblance of normal life. The recovered assets began arriving through the appropriate legal channels. First came the money from the safe deposit boxes, then the sales of the BMW and the jewelry, then finally the transfers from offshore accounts. By mid-June, he had received approximately $1.2 million of the $1.347 million that the court had ordered in restitution. The remaining $147,000 would probably never be recovered, lost in legal fees, assets Marcus had destroyed before being caught, or simply money that had been spent and couldn't be traced. But $1.2 million was enough. It was more than enough to save the dealership and begin rebuilding. Tom and I sat down and developed a 5-year plan to turn Carter Auto Sales around. First, we paid off all outstanding debts, every penny owed to suppliers, creditors, and back taxes. Seeing those accounts with a zero balance for the first time in over a year was incredibly liberating. Then, we rehired the employees we had been forced to lay off, including Sandra, who cried tears of joy when I called offering her job back with a 15% raise. We invested $200,000 in a marketing and public relations campaign focused on rebuilding the dealership's reputation, emphasizing that we had been victims of crime, not criminals, and that we had fully cooperated with authorities to bring those responsible to justice. Sales began to recover slowly. July was better than June, August better than July. We weren't back to pre-crisis levels, but the trend was positive for the first time in over a year. Clients who had avoided us during the scandal began to return, some saying they respected how we had handled the situation, that doing the right thing, even when it was costly, demonstrated integrity. Tom hired a new sales manager, a woman named Patricia Rodriguez, who had 20 years of experience in the industry and no connection to the mess Marcus had left behind. She brought fresh energy and new ideas, and for the first time in a long time, I began to feel something resembling hope for the future of the business. But while the dealership recovered, my relationship with my parents remained completely broken. They never called after the sentencing, never responded to my sporadic attempts at communication. I learned through a distant cousin that they visited Marcus once a month in the federal prison in Florence, Arizona, where he had been assigned. Apparently, Marcus was adapting reasonably well to the prison environment, working in the prison library and taking some online courses through a federal educational program. My mother was supposedly saving money to put credit in Marcus's commissary account, and my father had taken a part-time job at a Home Depot to help pay for the extra expenses related to prison visits. Hearing that my parents were working so hard to support Marcus while completely avoiding me should have made me angry. Instead, it just left me exhausted. I realized sometime during that summer that I had to let go. I had to stop waiting for them to change, stop trying to force a relationship they clearly didn't want. Linda had suggested therapy months before, and I finally agreed. I started seeing a therapist named Dr. Michael Chen once a week. The first few sessions were difficult, basically just me venting about how unfair it all was. But over time, Dr. Chen helped me understand that I couldn't control my parents' reactions or choices, only my own responses to them. Dr. Chen introduced the concept of ambiguous grief, which is when you lose someone who is still alive. I explained that this was exactly what I was experiencing with my parents and Marcus. They physically existed in the world, but the relationships I had with them were dead. And unlike literal death, where there is finality and social rituals to aid the grieving process, with ambiguous grief, you are stuck in this liminal space where you can't truly move on because technically the person is still there. The key, Dr. Chen said, was to create my own internal closure independent of their actions or validation. To accept that some relationships simply end, and that the ending doesn't need to make sense or be fair to be real. In August, something unexpected happened. I received a call from a social worker from Child Services in Maricopa County. She said she was calling about Tyler, Marcus, and Jessica's son. With both parents in prison, Tyler had been living with Jessica's aunt in Mesa, but that situation had become untenable for reasons she couldn't discuss over the phone. They were looking for relatives who could assume temporary guardianship of Tyler while his parents served their sentences. My parents in Tucson had been considered but rejected because they had insufficient income and age-related health problems. I was the next closest relative. The social worker asked if Linda and I would consider taking Tyler in. The question caught me completely off guard. Tyler was now 4 years old, a little boy I barely knew because Marcus and Jessica had limited contact after the affair began. He was innocent in all of this, a complete victim of his parents' selfish choices. But taking custody of him would mean massive responsibility, not just financial, but emotional. It would mean raising the son of the man who had betrayed me, constant reminders of everything that had happened. I told the social worker I needed to discuss it with my wife and that I would call back in a few days. When I hung up, I sat in stunned silence, not knowing at all how to feel about this impossible turn of events. Linda and I talked for hours that night. She stressed that Tyler was innocent, that nothing that happened was his fault, that he deserved a chance to grow up in a stable home with a caring family. But she also acknowledged that this would fundamentally change our lives. We didn't have children of our own after years of trying and eventually deciding it wasn't meant to be. Taking Tyler in would instantly mean becoming parents to a traumatized 4-year-old who would likely have significant emotional problems stemming from seeing both parents go to jail. It wouldn't be easy. But when had anything in my life been easy lately? Linda said the choice had to be mine, that she would support me no matter what, but that if we were considering it, we needed to be fully committed because Tyler deserved nothing less. I thought about it for 3 days. I thought about Marcus, about everything he had destroyed, about how taking on his son would be a form of ultimate responsibility I never asked for. But I also thought about who I wanted to be. Did I want to be the kind of person who let an innocent child suffer because of the parents' actions? Did I want Tyler to grow up in the foster care system, bouncing from home to home, never having stability or a real family? Or did I want to be the kind of person who did the right thing even when it was difficult, even when it cost a lot, even when it wasn't fair? Finally, I realized that if I rejected Tyler, I would become a little more like Marcus, letting my pain and resentment dictate my actions instead of my values. And if there was one thing this whole nightmare taught me, it was that I never wanted to be anything like my brother. I called the social worker and told her that Linda and I would be taking Tyler in. The process took several weeks: background checks, home visits, psychological evaluations. We had to go through training on childhood trauma and how to deal with children who had experienced significant loss. In mid-September, Tyler moved into our house with 2 small suitcases containing everything he owned in the world. He was a small boy with the same dark eyes as Marcus, dark, tousled hair, and a permanently confused expression that broke my heart. When the social worker left, Tyler stood in our living room looking around without saying anything, clearly terrified by yet another change in what had been a devastating year for him. Linda knelt down to his level and gently said that this was his new home now, that we would be taking care of him, and that he was safe. Tyler looked at her, then at me, and whispered, "Where's my mommy?" It was the first thing he had said since he arrived. Linda looked at me, unsure how to respond. I knelt down too and told the truth as simply as I could. I said that his mommy and daddy had made mistakes and needed to be away for a while, but that they loved him very much and that we would take care of him until they could come back. Tyler processed this for a moment, then asked if he had done something wrong. I held his small hands and said no, that he hadn't done anything wrong at all, that sometimes adults make bad choices and children aren't to blame. He nodded, but I could see in his eyes that he didn't fully believe me. The first few months with Tyler were incredibly challenging. He had frequent nightmares, waking up screaming in the middle of the night. He had emotional outbursts over small things, clearly processing trauma he couldn't put into words. He wet the bed several times a week. He refused to eat many foods, probably because everything in his life had changed so drastically that familiar food was one of the few things he could control. Linda and I took turns waking up with him, calming him, reassuring him he was safe. We found a child therapist specializing in trauma, and Tyler began weekly sessions. Slowly, gradually, he began to adjust. The meltdowns became less frequent, the nightmares lessened. He started smiling occasionally, even laughing. One night in October, about 6 weeks after Tyler moved in, something changed. We were having dinner, just simple conversation about his day at preschool when he looked at me and said, "Uncle Danny, are you my dad now?" The question caught me completely off guard. I looked at Linda, who had tears in her eyes. I told Tyler that I was his uncle and would be looking after him, but that his father was Marcus and always would be. Tyler thought about it, then said, "But Dad's not here." "You are. So can you be like my dad until he comes back?" The lump in my throat was so big I could barely speak. I confirmed, said yes. I would be like his dad until Marcus could be with him again. Tyler nodded contentedly and went back to eating his macaroni and cheese as if he hadn't just fundamentally changed my entire world. The following months brought a slow but undeniable transformation. Tyler began to blossom in ways I hadn't anticipated. At preschool, his teacher, Miss Jennifer, commented that he was opening up more, making friends, participating in activities instead of sitting quietly in the corner as he had done in the first few weeks. At home, he began to call Linda Aunt Linda with genuine affection, and with me he developed a nightly ritual where I read to him before bed. Always the same 3 books, Where the Wild Things Are, The Very Hungry Caterpillar, and Goodnight Moon. He memorized every word, but still wanted me to read every night, and I realized it wasn't about the stories. It was about the consistency, the predictability, the security of a ritual that never changed. The dealership continued its steady recovery. In December, we had our best month since before the fraud was discovered, selling 48 cars and finally surpassing our historical average. Tom took me to a celebratory dinner at a steakhouse in Scottsdale, where we toasted not only to the numbers, but to survival. He said something that night that stuck with me. "You know, Danny, some companies wouldn't have survived what we went through, but we're not just a company. We're a family, a real family, not that toxic kind based solely on blood." I looked around the table at Tom, Patricia, Sandra, and some of the other employees who had been with us, and realized he was absolutely right. These people, who had stood by me during the worst period of my life, were my real family. That Thanksgiving, Linda and I created our own tradition. We invited all the dealership employees and their families to a big dinner at our house. There were over 40 people crammed into our living room and backyard, children running everywhere, laughter and conversation filling every space. Tyler was at the center of it all, playing with the other kids, his laughter loud and genuine for the first time since he moved in with us. When it came time to give thanks before the meal, I stood and looked at all those people who had become my chosen family. I gave thanks not for the easy year, because it certainly wasn't, but for the year that taught us who we really were and what we were capable of when faced with adversity. Christmas was quieter. Just Linda, Tyler, and I. We put up a tree for the first time in years, Tyler insisting on putting on every ornament himself, his tongue sticking out of one side of his mouth in concentration. We bought him too many presents, probably to compensate, but seeing his genuine joy opening each package made it worth every penny. That night, after we put Tyler to bed, Linda and I sat by the lit tree with glasses of wine. She said this had been the strangest Christmas of her life, full of happiness, but also permeated by the sadness of everything that had been lost. I agreed, but added that perhaps that was the reality now, joy and sadness coexisting, neither cancelling out the other, both being true simultaneously. In January, almost exactly a year after Marcus's confession, I received a letter from him from prison. It was the first communication since that letter before sentencing. Marcus wrote that he had been thinking a lot, that prison gave him a lot of time for reflection, sometimes too much. He had completed his GED, even though he already had a high school diploma, just to have something to do. He was working as a reading tutor for other prisoners struggling with literacy. He said that finding a way to help others, even in a small capacity, made him feel a little less useless. Marcus asked about the dealership, if it had survived, and said he sincerely hoped so because destroying my business had never been his intention, even if it was the inevitable result of his actions. Then Marcus asked about Tyler. He said that Jessica kept him updated through letters about the boy living with us, and that this made him simultaneously grateful and devastated. Grateful because Tyler was with family who could take good care of him. Devastated because it should have been Marcus raising his own son. He wrote, "I know I have no right to ask anything of you after what I did, but if you could occasionally send a picture of Tyler, maybe a brief update on how he is doing, it would mean everything to me. I know he probably barely remembers me now, and by the time he's old enough for prison visits, years will have passed. But he's my son, and even though I'm the worst father in the world, I still love him more than anything else." I held on to that letter for days, unsure how to respond. Part of me wanted to ignore it completely, to deny Marcus even this small request, just as he had denied me so often. But I thought about Tyler, about how he occasionally asked about his father, about how he deserved to know that Marcus still thought about him, still cared. Finally, I wrote a short reply. I said that the dealership had survived, that we were slowly recovering. I confirmed that Tyler was with us and was adjusting well, that he was going to school, making friends, and receiving therapy to process everything that had happened. I said I would send a photo occasionally, not for Marcus, but for Tyler, because every child deserves to know that their parents love them, even when those parents have made terrible mistakes. I included a recent photo of Tyler on the school playground, smiling as he went down a slide. I didn't mention my parents, didn't ask about them, didn't offer any bridge to rebuild that relationship. Some things were too broken to fix, and I had made peace with that. I ended the letter saying that I hoped Marcus would use his years in prison to genuinely become a better person, because when he got out, Tyler would be a teenager who needed a father. Not the excuses or denials of the past, but a genuinely transformed man who would take full responsibility and be worthy of a second chance. I sealed the letter and sent it without rereading it, because if I thought about it too much, I would probably change my mind. Marcus's reply came 3 weeks later. It was shorter than his previous letters, just 1 page. He thanked me for the photo, said he had cried when he saw it, that Tyler had grown so much and seemed so happy. He said my words about using his time wisely had touched a deep place in him, that I was sure Tyler deserved better than the father he had been. Marcus was signing up for rehabilitation programs, therapy groups, anything available in the prison system that could help him understand why he had made the choices he had and how to become different. He wasn't doing it for sentence reduction, he wrote, but because if he didn't fundamentally change as a person, the next 13 years would be wasted, and he would leave being the same person he went in. He ended simply, "Thank you for being a better man than I ever was. Tyler is lucky to have you." Spring brought more positive changes. The dealership signed a large contract with a corporate fleet that needed 30 vehicles, our largest single deal in 3 years. Tom was officially promoted to CFO, a title he had long deserved. We hired 5 more employees, bringing our total back to 28 people, more than we had before the crisis. I launched a non-profit foundation focused on helping small businesses that were victims of employee fraud, offering free legal advice and small recovery loans. It was my way of turning something terrible that happened to me into something that could help others. Richard Bowman agreed to serve on the foundation's board, as did Agent Morrison, who had retired from the FBI. Tyler turned 5 in April, and we had a birthday party at home with all the kids from his class. Seeing 15 children running around the yard, eating cake, laughing with that uncomplicated happiness that only children have, was both joyful and bittersweet. I thought about how Tyler's life could have been different if Marcus and Jessica had made different choices, if greed hadn't consumed them. But then, Tyler ran to me with cake frosting all over his face, hugged me tightly, and said this was the best birthday ever, and I realized that maybe the path he was on now, however bumpy and painful it had been to get here, was exactly where he needed to be. In May, on the 1-year anniversary of my sentencing, I received a completely unexpected letter. It was from my parents, my mother's handwriting, those familiar letters I knew from countless shopping lists and love notes in my lunchbox as a child. I opened it with trembling hands, not knowing what to expect. The letter was short, just a few paragraphs. My mother wrote that they had seen Tyler the previous weekend when they visited Marcus in prison. That Marcus had spoken about how Tyler was thriving under our care, about how I was sending photos and updates, that seeing Tyler happy and healthy instead of traumatized and lost had changed something in her. She wrote, "I wasn't ready to admit I was wrong about you. I still don't know if I'm ready now. But I can admit that you did the right thing taking care of Tyler when you could easily have turned your back on me." The letter continued, "Your father and I have been in a lot of therapy this past year. Our pastor encouraged us, saying we were carrying anger that was destroying us. We are beginning to understand that we can love Marcus and still acknowledge that what he did was terribly wrong, that we can support him through his prison sentence while also acknowledging how much he hurt you. These two things don't have to be mutually exclusive. I'm not asking for forgiveness because I don't know if I deserve it, but I am asking if perhaps eventually we can talk. Maybe get to know Tyler properly. He is our grandson, and we let anger steal an entire year from us with him. We don't want to waste any more time." There was no signature from my father, but a line written in his handwriting was added at the end. "Your son is right. I was a fool. I'm sorry." I read that letter 5 times, each time searching for sincerity, weighing my words against years of pain. It wasn't a complete apology. It didn't undo the year of silence and rejection. But it was something. It was a start. I showed the letter to Linda, who had tears in her eyes. She said the choice was entirely mine, that she would support me whether I wanted to respond or keep my distance. I thought about it for days. Finally, I wrote back. My letter was careful, guarded. I said I appreciated their reach out, that I understood it had been a difficult year for everyone, that I wasn't ready to forget or pretend what happened didn't matter, but I was willing to take small steps toward rebuilding some kind of relationship. I offered that they come visit Tyler, get to know him properly, see how he was thriving. I set clear boundaries. No discussions about Marcus, no recriminations about the past, just focus on moving forward one day at a time. My parents came over for Sunday brunch in June. It was incredibly awkward and uncomfortable at first, everyone trying too hard, forced conversation about the weather and work. But then Tyler, unaware of the history or tension, ran up to my mom and asked who she was. My mom knelt down, tears already welling up, and said, "I'm your grandma." Tyler thought about it, then said, "I've never had a grandma before. That's cool." And just like that, with the innocent simplicity of a child, some of the tension melted away. My parents spent the afternoon playing with Tyler, and I saw something in their eyes that I hadn't seen in a long time. Genuine joy. When they left, my mom hugged me briefly, awkwardly, and whispered, "Thank you for letting us meet him." It wasn't a complete reconciliation, but it was something. Over the following months, we developed a cautious but growing relationship. My parents began visiting once a month, always focused on Tyler, but slowly rebuilding some connection with me as well. We never spoke directly about everything that happened, about the year of silence, about the cruel things that were said and done. Perhaps we never would. Some wounds are too deep to be fully explored without dangerously reopening them. But we learned to exist in the same space, to share meals, to focus on the present and future, instead of being stuck in the past. It wasn't the family relationship I had before everything fell apart, but it was a relationship, and that was more than I thought I would have. Now, sitting here 2 years after discovering Marcus's betrayal, I look at my life and barely recognize it. The dealership not only survived, but is thriving, on track for its best financial year ever. Tyler is thriving in first grade, a happy and well-adjusted boy who still has occasional rough nights, but is generally okay. Linda and I are parents now, something we never planned, but which has become the most meaningful and fulfilling thing we've ever done. My parents are back in our lives in a limited but real way. The wound caused by Marcus's betrayal will never fully heal. It will leave a scar I will carry forever, but it no longer defines me. I learned things during these 2 years that I never wanted to learn. I learned that blood ties don't guarantee loyalty or love. I learned that forgiveness is complicated and not always necessary to move on. I learned that justice, when it finally comes, rarely looks like you imagined and never fills the void left by betrayal. I learned that some people will destroy everything around them because they are broken inside and don't know how to fix themselves without dragging others down. And I learned that survival, true survival, isn't just about staying alive, but about actively choosing to rebuild, creating meaning from chaos, finding purpose in pain. Marcus still has 11 years left on his sentence. Jessica will be released in about a year and is planning to move to Oregon to start over where no one knows her story. Tyler will eventually be old enough for prison visits, and when that day comes, it will be his decision whether he wants to meet the father he barely remembers. I won't force him in any way. He deserves to make his own choices about what relationships he wants in his life. Meanwhile, I'm here, raising him, loving him, giving him the stability his parents couldn't provide. It's not the life I imagined for myself, but maybe it's the life I needed, the life that made me stronger, more compassionate, more aware of what truly matters. If there's one lesson in all of this, I suppose it's this. You can't control what other people do to you. You can't prevent betrayal. You can't force loyalty. You can't make people love you the way you deserve to be loved. But you can control who you become in response. You can choose not to let their betrayal make you bitter or cruel. You can choose to cut out toxic people while keeping the door open for those who genuinely try to change. You can choose to build a new family of people who deserve your trust instead of wasting energy trying to fix irreparably broken relationships. And you can choose every day to be the person you wish your brother had been, honest, loyal, upright, and strong enough to do the right thing even when it costs everything. Marcus betrayed me in the worst possible way. He stole my money, ruined my business, destroyed our family, and left scars that will never fully disappear. But he didn't destroy me. I'm still here, still standing, still building something meaningful. And perhaps that's the ultimate revenge. Not that he's in prison suffering, but that I refuse to let his actions define the rest of my life. Did I cut him out of my life forever? Yes. The Marcus I knew no longer exists, if he ever truly did. But I created a new life from the ashes of the old, and that new life, however imperfect, is mine, and no one, not even my brother, can ever take that away from me again.